outside the wall. And this week we're going to be talking about American Psycho, directed by Mary Harron. I'm here with Evil Dex and Wally.
Hello.
Hello.
This is our second film in our female directors fortnight. Uh, Last time we watched Lost in Translation by Sofia Coppola, and both the past film and this one, I believe, were recommend not recommendations but choices of mine. To American Psycho was a recommendation, so we'll start with Wally's opinion on this one.
Yeah, so American Psycho was one of these movies that friends of mine have been telling me to see for years now. It's one of these films that if you know Christian Bale as the actor and what he does and what steps he goes through to become a character in a film, this is definitely one of those, maybe four or five that springs to mind. This was definitely one that I did enjoy, and it paired. We actually, in our next discussion for our next episode, we'll be discussing another movie that tends to get paired with this, which is Wall Street. But this very much was a nice, I'll just say nice. It very much was a critique on 80s corporate culture and 80s capitalism and this consumerist culture, which definitely I enjoyed because it's, I think, one of those topics that tends to get overlooked or not talked about that often, even today. So, this is basically what is interesting about this film for me is that Christian Bale's character, Patrick Bateman, is a very successful financier in downtown New York. Has the fancy flat apartment, has the good-looking fiance, can wine and dine all the nice places, but deep inside, his soul is in turmoil to the point where he kind of openly comments on it to his fiance and some others, but then winds up having a much darker side in some of his schizophrenic nightmares and hallucinations and even urges just to commit murder and other more grotesque scenes that cause him to basically lose his sanity over the course of the movie. This is actually based on a novel of the same name. The novel itself actually is a little more grotesque in that there's things like cannibalism involved, where there isn't so much in the. At least I don't notice it in this movie. But this is very much a good look at both this corporate culture, particularly in the '80s, as well as a good study on Christian Bale as an actor and how he performs. And I think that's all I'll say without getting too much more long-winded.
Okay. So I have two complaints about this movie. The first is just that it underutilizes Willem Dafoe, I think. Willem Dafoe is one of my favorite actors, so it's nice to see him. I just wish he had gotten a few more scenes. And his character seems to be onto uh, Patrick Bateman throughout the movie, but it doesn't. There's no real resolution to that plot line. I think you can argue that there is some artistic intent behind that, but it does come off as a little odd on a first viewing. And then secondly, I would say that I was pretty bored throughout actually the first half hour or so of this film. I think it has a weakness of exaggerating its anti-corporatist satire a little bit too much during some of the early scenes where it was just Patrick Bateman and his friends going on about how much rich elitist assholes they were. I kind of had this feeling of, okay, I get the point. I guess as an example of that, I think the scene where he like berates and then murders the homeless guy and his dog kind of qualifies. But as it moved on, I actually did become a lot more interested in it once the main character started coming up against sort of the mass indifference of humanity, and it actually makes a kind of amusing point of comparison with one of my favorite novels, The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy, which is they both have that commentary on a successful administrative worker. Let's say Ivan Ilyich is a civil servant who nonetheless has sort of empty and dissatisfying life and soul, and the ultimate contrast that at the end of Ivan Illich's life when he dies, nobody cares, And Patrick Bateman is revealed to be a murderer and nobody around him cares. And they also fail to notice what he's doing for far too long simply because of their own indifference. I thought that aspect of it was actually very interesting and redeemed it a lot in my eyes. So it's a movie that I have a good respect for, and it may, in fact, overtake Shrek as my favorite female directed movie.
Okay. Um, yeah. So Mike, case I quite love this film, and as as Wally mentioned, there is they do mention cannibalism, but they don't really show it. Perhaps in one scene, but we'll get more into that later on. My case, this film had been recommended to me in the past, and last year I got to watch it. This was my second viewing of it, and I very much enjoyed it. Almost as much, let's say, at the first time. So it held up very well for me. I, as Wally and Alex have already mentioned, they do a lot of corporate satire about it, and I found that quite amusing. Of having also working as similar environments to a lower extent. It's not as exaggerated in the fact that it will be as highbrow, let's say, as the kind of jet set life that these guys have, but in the sense of the scene when they start comparing the in, the business cards that they have, and it's similar sometimes to how in an office environment people start comparing a lot of utensils that they use day to day, and like, which one has the better one. It's kind of look like who has the bigger dick contest, but a lot of the how it does how people mentioned that they do exaggerate a lot of the elements of it. I think it's done very well, and it's very amusing to watch. Something that I very much enjoy to in how he's in this jet set life. However, he's just out of it, and even when he does, as I mentioned before, he does openly. Uh, he basically confesses this crime. People around it don't really notice it, and it's like a lot of noise. It's just something there in a lot of noise, and nobody takes notice of it. Willem Dafoe's character is underutilized. I do agree to that. However, I think the part of the reason of that is that it's meant to showcase that sometimes some people just that are high enough in life they get away with stuff because they don't tend to be the spotlight as much. But at the end, when they have their last final, when they have their last lunch together, he just says like, "Oh yeah, you were in this party with this other guy," and he confirmed your stay there, and how they pretty much follow the same mold in life, and they get confused with one another when it's like, "Oh, this is Paul Allen," but he isn't Paul Allen. He's actually Patrick Bateman, or he's confused by someone else. One of my favorite, how even despite Bateman's loading of the of every human inside, I did enjoy it how he maintained a good sense, let's say, of appreciation for music, and his musical monologues are one of my favorite, some of my favorite scenes in the film. I think they actually are my favorite when I think about it more. But it is amusing to see how he gets so worked up and it's talking. Have you ever heard about Hugh Lewis in the news? And then he starts exposing this. I actually got a bit reminded of some of the music discussions that I had because I do quite a lot of music. It's probably what I enjoy the most in life. And yeah, I think this film is quite a watch. So
Well, I think too, to go off of what you were saying about the music, with them discussing him discussing music and comparing their business cards and stuff. It's also not just a critique on capitalist culture, corporate culture, but it's also a critique on consumerism in general. I mean, the very opening kind of monologue of the film, you have Bateman going through and with a very meticulous, step by step, very specific sort of products he uses, very specific sort of routine he does, very specific sort of exercises he does, to the point where it very much is like, oh, like if you want to be like me and successful, you have to use almond butter shampoo, or then just it gets into that sort of ridiculousness. Then to go off with the business card comparison, I actually found that quite hilarious because it is very much like a machismo schoolyard like comparison. Like, oh, mine's better than yours. No, mine's better, and it's just something so silly like what color white the card is and what the type of font is, which to the layman's eyes is indiscernible, but to these kind of high and mighty, uh, I guess I can use the term fuckwits. It means a lot to them, and just kind of that sort of whole critique as well on uh, Bateman when he does compares music and stuff, which is ironic because the music he's not exposing, the music he's explaining and kind of drawing inspiration on is very much not avant-garde or not highbrow. It's very kind of popish, lowbrow type of music, and it's just that sort of sense of irony that I noticed in there that sticks out. That kind of is shout against this sort of consumerist highbrow culture.
Okay, when you do make the comment of how his music is a more popish on the more mainstream side, let's say it is a music. He pretty much admits that to a point when he starts talking about Phil Collins, and he mentions about how he didn't like the Genesis era of Peter Gabriel's, who
Yes,
is by some people consider better one because he is more into a progressive rock and
more artistic,
more
et cetera, et
artistic.
cetera. But then when Phil basically
Yeah.
breaks off on his own, that's when he becomes more. I think they even uses the word mainstream.
Indeed, he does. He does mention that it's more mainstream. He didn't comprehend the Peter Gabriel era of Genesis. He couldn't get into
Yeah.
it.
He also comments a lot on the like financial aspects of the music. So
Yes, like Huey Lewis, I know he expounds upon their struggles as a band.
yeah, which is part of the satire as well, because some other people, even like me, I guess, who are into sort of artistic analysis, probably wouldn't think of that as an area worth emphasizing.
Yeah, no, I think I think those are some of the most amusing sequences in the film for me.
Yeah,
And
even though I complained about some of the early satirical scenes, I should say that I actually really like the comparing the business card scene too.
yeah, it's very good. And how what you did mention about if you want to be like me, and we can. It does also state that well, Patrick Bateman and also Christian Bale, their dedication, let's say, to whatever it is they're trying to achieve, as Wally mentioned at the start, the the preparation that Christian Bale has to do, he follows when he gets into a character. The Patrick Bateman is really one of them. You can notice that the routine that he follows in his day to day as Patrick Bateman is quite an intense one, actually, to at least in the exercise one. And the other one is a lot of consumerism, what kind of product he uses to look good and everything. And
Yes, now
you can say that at least Patrick Bateman is also quite dedicated to looking that good.
Yeah, so one of the things you're talking about is how Christian Bale will physically transform himself for specific roles. I think probably the most eloquent example of that is in the movie The Machinist. He played basically like anorexic or something along those lines. So that he was like really, really thin, and he actually played that role in between two Batman movies. So he had to bulk up to become Bruce Wayne, and then turn into this tiny guy for The Machinist, and then back to bulking up for Batman again.
and then he really bulked up in that Hollywood 70s ish movie that came out, I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago, American
American
Hustle.
Hustle.
Yeah, where he had like a dad bod beer gut,
It's
and
insane.
to the point, that now it's joked. I remember. I think I shared with this joke with you guys that Christian Bale apparently has been cast in the new Dune movie as the Worm, and he gained like 300 tons of weight in order to play the Worm. So it's when it becomes that sort of in joke, you know how serious he takes his roles and how serious he prepares for them.
Yeah.
But actually, something I wanted to comment on with this film, this being my first real time seeing it end to end, I've seen clips of it numerous times on the internet, but seeing it end to end, I know the intention, I think, is that no one, like all of these murders that Bateman does, just no one cares about. I actually was under the impression that all of those murders were fictitious and that it was just Bateman basically in his head committing all of these things to kind of cope with his what the reality is going outside with all this kind of hoity-toity of fighting to be the get the corner office type of thing, and this is his way of kind of coping with that. There's a couple scenes in particular that I think lent me to this. The one of the opening scenes or one of the first scenes where they're in this bar or this club, and the bartender, who's a female, gives him some off the cuff remark, and when she turns around to go fill the drink, he like yells some obscenity at her, and she doesn't even notice it at all. It makes me wonder if whether that was just something he was thinking he said, uh, and but we still like, and it's that whole, to me there was this mystery of whether or not what he's doing is real or not, and even to the point where at the end he doesn't even know if it's real or not. After he goes through that whole kind of shooting rampage where he is at the ATM machine and then that shoots the old lady and then winds up just running up to his office. There's a couple of other scenes like that too where I noticed that I think to me it just didn't seem like any of it was real, and I think he realized that as well. And I was curious if you guys felt that same way, or if you felt, as I think how one of you said, it's just basically more of a satire, and that no one cares what he's doing because of the lifestyle.
Okay, Ray, why don't you start?
I think it's an interesting theory. I always thought that the last sequence, when he, as you mentioned, the ATM machine one, and then he ends up shooting some NYPD cops, and the explosion and everything is to an extent an hallucination, or I can say that about all the murders in the film.
Yes, because
Uh,
that was another one where he shoots the cop car and it blows up, and the camera shows him like looking at his pistol, like what the
yeah,
hell
yeah,
just happened. And another instance too is when he's earlier in the film when he's working out. There's some like Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie playing on in the background with a guy running with a chainsaw. And then we later in the film find out that he actually is, or apparently, trying to murder people with chainsaws. So I'm wondering whether or not if him just seeing these things, like having taking these almost sort of sadomasochist fantasies by like working out or getting a hard on essentially by working out and watching these thrasher films, that he's getting these ideas of just what would he do if he could do it, and that's just pans out later in the film to be one of those instances.
yeah. I think he does murder some people because when he overtakes Paul Owen's apartment, and he takes, I think Elizabeth was her name, and then the one that he called Christy, and when the prostitute is trying to escape, she ends up finding some of the bodies that Bateman has already murdered, and later on when he comes back to try to like clean up the apartment, he finds that it's all totally clean, and the lady that is listening it makes a comment that like implying she knows something happened there, and she just asks him to leave. So I think to an extent some of those murders did happen. However, I do agree that some of them might have been hallucinations. At the very least, the the cup explosion and the cars exploding and everything might be just like a that kind of trip that Bateman went on to the end.
Well, and the fact too that at the beginning of that scene, the ATM specifically prints a message saying
Yeah,
"Feed
feed me
me
a
a
cat.
kitten,"
Yeah.
which
Stray
is
cat, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that part's obviously part of his psychosis.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I think I take Raim's stance that there's too much evidence in the film to, including the presence of Willem Dafoe's character, to really say that all of it's hallucinatory. But I do think that's a good angle to look at the film from, because I think there are probably a lot of people who are like a version of Patrick Bateman who never puts his actions into reality and does just fantasize about it. And also, you can take the idea that whether his crimes are real in a sense doesn't matter, at least according to the perceptions of everybody around him. So that's an interesting way to think about it. Another scene that we might use to try to prove this theory actually is near the end when he's talking to the lawyer, and he says that he can't possibly. The lawyer tells him that he can't possibly have murdered the one other big wig that he did kill.
Paul Allen.
Yeah, because he had dinner with him like a couple of weeks ago.
In London, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
But
I think one of the ways to say that can be disproven is what I mentioned at the start, that everybody gets confused with everybody. They think Patrick Bateman is well, the lawyer himself actually thinks that he isn't Patrick Bateman, but that he's someone else. And
yeah, I
like,
think that's the intention behind the lawyer saying that in the actual film. Yes, is that he's just mistaken somebody else for Paul Allen because all of these men are essentially interchangeable as a result of the culture that they reside in, which is the film's criticism.
Indeed, they're just mass produced and mass molded.
See, the part of me though was also thinking that Christian Bale's like real life character actually is the one that people are mistaking him for, and Patrick Bateman is his quote unquote fake persona that he has in his head, and that basically commits all of these sort of grotesque murders to satiate his kind of insanity that's happening to him.
Okay. So there is no Patrick Bateman in a more literal sense than what
Right.
Patrick Bateman tells us.
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense actually.
Yeah, that would be that's interesting. I have to rewatch it then to keep more an eye on of the Patrick mentions.
But I think Exteth, you also hit a point too about the sort of individuals who basically would want to do these things but could never carry them out. It's always, at least I've noticed, as far as the whole disgruntled worker scenario, it's always the ones that don't say anything, that aren't upfront about it, that aren't verbally, saying, "Oh, I'm going to shoot up the building" to their coworkers and stuff. They're not the ones that actually do it. It's the ones who are quiet and basically seem normal, seem happy, because every time one of these events happens and you get witnesses or you get family or friends or coworkers interviewed by people, they all say the same thing. "Oh, he was so nice. He seemed okay." And then one day he just murders 12 people. So I think it's definitely maybe more in that. It's also a critique on that, like the individuals who just get so fed up that they don't actually do it. They just commit it in their minds to kind of as their form of escapism.
Yeah, there's a kind of repressive and sort of doormat person who continually lets other people beat up on him or take advantage of him and gets more and more frustrated over time. And that does tend to boil over into something bad, not necessarily a killing spree, but maybe just a freak out one day or mental breakdown or something like that for sure. And that's kind of what Patrick Bateman is.
Bottle up frustrations tend to explode after all.
Yeah.
So what Wally mentioned about always the one that have never made any kind of sign of any stimulus to their day to day. Like when you mentioned someone is substance or something that it's on their nerves, they just like bottle up and one day explodes. So in that case, I think it is valid to apply that to an extent to Patrick Bateman, with how he acts, and he's in this clean, perfect world, but he clearly doesn't really enjoy it. It's just living a facade, and it could be seen, as it's Patrick Bateman is the alter ego in that sense, where he lives out his fantasies, his repressed fantasies. I think that's a really interesting point to take.
Okay, so something I want to comment on is how the film uses the character of Patrick Bateman to play with the expectations of the viewer. I think one of the problems I observed in the early parts of it is that because the more you get familiar with him and his like psychotic tendencies, the more certain parts of the movie become predictable in a sense. So almost every scene where he's in private with somebody, you know that he's going to start murder them and probably succeed. And I think that led to a certain sense of repetitiousness, but it is also used to create a strong sense of tension, which I think can be quite effective in some scenes. And the particular one that I want to highlight is the one where somebody actually survives, the where he has the secretary in his apartment with him, and he's
Right.
kind of trying to restrain himself from killing her in particular, and but it still comes very very close. I think that is quite a like tense, attention grabbing scene, and serves to humanize Patrick Bateman's character a little bit, and also the secretary character is one of the only ones that I really sympathized with in that film. So I think that was part of the reason it had that greater sense of tension, was because it was easier to care about whether or not she actually made it out alive, compared to almost everybody else in the film.
Right. Actually, two things I want to comment on that particular scene. One, and I don't want to drag this theory of mine on, but I think that instance of the secretary, that was actually real life. That was actually real Patrick Bateman, not his imagination committing a murder. It was actually him coming basically at the knife's edge of doing it, and then, but actually doesn't do it, which I think can comment on what we were stating before. But the other thing was a minor complaint or misstep I noticed is that the weapon he chooses to attempt to murder the secretary is a pneumatic nail gun, sorry. And all pneumatic nail guns have to be plugged in because they're air pressurized. And if you notice, at least I noticed, there was no cord.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way to actually trigger a nail from coming out of the gun is not only pulling the trigger, but there's a little nip on the end of the barrel that you actually have to push down on and pressurize in order to actually fire anything. And in this instance, it was if he had committed the murder, it looked like that wouldn't have been the case, that he would have done it like a few inches away from her head rather than actually pressing it up on her head and then pulling the trigger. So those were just my years working in hardware and the electrical work. I kind of noticed that little misstep, but otherwise, I guess it's forgivable in a way.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty minor issue for the film to have for sure.
It is, I think, inevitable to make that kind of observations and critique when you work in something like that. I think a lot about this whenever there are certain software situations in movies. Some of them are, as Wally said, forgivable or are actually pretty well done. But I hadn't thought about that, about the nail one, because I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, that's just an aside. That's just something I noticed that I don't think should bring down the film in any way.
But yeah, I think as with Evil Dead said, Gene is probably, I'd say, the first one that it came close to dying and that you could sympathize with because you have been with her for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
And it is nice that the moment comes after, as Evil Dead said, as I mentioned, that you would think he will do it, but still not sure, and it keeps on building that tension. It is very nice when they do play with that.
Well, not
And
only that. Sorry, continue.
no, and I was just going to mention that I think Christy is a bit like that too, because we already been with her once, and Patrick has clearly already abused of her once. So the second time around, she's on the edge, trying to, hoping that nothing worse comes of it. She just like bails on him on a threesome, and then she notices that he's actually killing the other girl, so she runs out. So I think Christy was another one that I could say that to an extent you could also sympathize with.
Well, definitely the secretary, because even later in the film, we find out that she's the only one who actually realizes what Bateman is going through, because she comes across his planner, and as she's slowly going through pages, there's drawings that he's doing, and then they become more and more grotesque and masochistic and sexualized to the point where she almost has like a emotional breakdown looking at it, which I think also, one, like I said, lends into the audience to be more sympathetic with her and Bateman in a sense, and two, also I think is another thing for at least my own little pet theory that it isn't really he has actually isn't really committing all these things. He's kind of doing it in his mind, and him drawing all this stuff on in his planner is one of those ways of outletting that energy of his.
So I think this secretary is worth commenting on because she also is probably used as a kind of outside observer of the corporate culture that the film's criticizing. Because even though she is technically part of that system, I think the way that she reacts to it is distinct from everybody else.
Yes, she seems to be the only one that has any sort of grounding in reality in the film.
She's not really interested in the dick measuring contest and stuff like that. She's actually thinking of trying to go back to school and get into a different area of life and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think it also applies to the fact that she's also most likely not in the same financial range that all of these other guys and the girls they date are. She's probably
Correct.
just middle class or middle. She's still struggling in life, while the other ones clearly have too much free time, let's say, in their hands.
And I think the last scene where she discovers that he's the killer, as well as the last scene with Defoe, where he seems to be on to Patrick Bateman, are both used to imply the possibility of him being discovered and punished in the future, although we don't see it, which kind of gives us another possible dynamic to look at with the movie.
Right, yeah, because the movie itself definitely doesn't have the common sort of closure that other, let's say, more mainstream films tend to have, where it's everything's wrapped up by the end and you have that sort of answer, whereas this is very ambiguous, the ending.
Yeah, it's arguably an example of a story where it does have that kind of resolution, but it's not shown. Hints are given to the viewer to infer what happens himself. Although it's not completely clear, because we can also take the interpretation that he never gets discovered.
Yeah, I think I actually quite like that Patrick Bateman is pretty much unpunished, and he does make this comment in his final monologue that his punishment continues to elude him, and he just doesn't get any closer to understanding himself. The entire confession, that's his final line. Yeah, I believe this confession has meant nothing. It's just all there wrapping arms, but I think I prefer that take that he is out there loose.
Yeah, we can make another Russian literature comparison with Crime and Punishment, where when Alyosha's crimes are discovered and he's sent off to Siberia for it, there's a sort of spiritually cleansing element to that, and you can almost take the interpretation that Patrick Bateman is denied that and is kind of wishing for it in the ending. He almost wants to be caught.
Indeed,
because he feels he deserves to get punished, something like that.
It does feel like he
I think he even states that he can't take it anymore, essentially, and is why he's handing himself in.
Indeed, yeah, it is that he has very much opened his darkness in the hopes that he is captured for it, punished for it, but
yeah,
it doesn't
so
matter.
Yeah, Alyosha, Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment actually does confess his crimes, and then with Patrick Bateman we have this scene where he attempts to confess his crimes but nobody will believe him.
Twice, in fact.
Yeah, he is quite the elusive one. Yeah, I think that Crime and Punishment is I actually seen it in another something else that I kind of mentioned of him willingly going into Siberia, so but it is an inappropriate one, I said. You mentioned two Russian films now for this? No, sorry, two Russian novels for this film now.
Yeah.
It's Quite interesting.
It's inevitable when you're talking to me that I'll find a way to shoehorn Russian literature into it at some point.
Okay, we have to showcase our Russian appreciation in our podcast.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have anything else to really comment on other than continuing my theory.
Okay, yeah, I think we've given a good sort of broad analysis of the interesting themes and stuff in this movie, so we can end it here if we like.
Yeah, then thank you for listening to us and see you next time then.
Yep, see ya.
Bye.